September 22nd, 2021, Tuam Cemetery. The coffin had barely touched the ground when the screaming started. A 70-year-old woman's funeral had drawn families from all across town. Some came to grieve. At the same time, others came for something else entirely.
You're a fool yourself. You're afraid of me. I owned you. You're only no bitch now around Tuam. But when I see you in Tuam, I'm pulling you anyway, regardless.
Gravestones shattered. Rocks and wooden crosses flew through the air. Children ducked behind headstones, while men bled into the grass. A priest dropped to his knees, shielding himself behind a tree. One man had to be airlifted by helicopter. Another, stabbed multiple times, was pulled from the gravesite, soaked in blood. And by the time Garda reinforcements swarmed the cemetery, it looked less like a funeral and more like a battlefield. But this marked more than a violent clash. It was the return of a reckoning shaped over 25 years. The Wards and the McDonaghs, two traveller families bound by blood, pride, and a grudge buried deeper than any grave in Tuam.
Unfortunately, the money is on the fight. It's over me and Michael's hands.
And what happened that day was not the beginning. It was a rupture, a breach in a fragile truce forged decades ago. But what caused it? Why did it start? And who truly broke the peace first? Understanding that moment requires returning to the day a man stood on the wrong grave, when history, once buried, came violently back to life, before that coffin hit the earth in 2021, before the blood stained the grass, and a priest hid behind a tree. Something had already been buried in Tuam. Not a person, but a grudge. It began with a misstep, 1 foot on sacred ground, and decades of buried fury came roaring to life. June 1996, Tuam, County Galway. It was supposed to be a solemn farewell. Family, neighbours, prayers, a quiet traveller funeral for a man named Bernie Mongan. Then someone saw Bernard Bernie McDonagh standing where he should not have been, on a grave belonging to the Wards. Ned Ward's voice cut through the still air. "Get off the effing grave." Bernie stepped down and apologised, but it was too late. Ned swung first, allegedly with a knuckle duster, and the rest of the Wards surged forward. Mourners became combatants. Peace became chaos. What followed was not a scuffle. It was an eruption. Up to 400 people from the extended clans turned Tuam Cemetery into a war zone. Fists, boots, stones. Anything could be a weapon. And everything was. A McDonagh woman was struck in the face by a rock. Her nose was broken. Another daughter of the family was beaten unconscious. The dead were forgotten. Even the grieving family found themselves caught in the crossfire. It should have ended at the graveside. It did not. The next day, June 3rd, the battle moved to Weir Road. A mob of over 100 people descended on the McDonagh home. Slash hooks, iron bars, hatchets, hammers, shovels, stones. Urban warfare in broad daylight. One Garda sergeant saw Dennis Ward holding a shotgun, said he heard a shot fired. Inside the house, Edward McDonagh, Senior's wife, was struck with a spade. His teenage daughter, already unconscious from the funeral attack, lay defenceless. When Gardaí finally intervened, they found a street littered with broken weapons and blood. Judge Michael Connellan later called it a complete act of savagery and shook his head at the thought. One side took up arms over somebody standing on a grave, but by then the damage was done. What began as a single moment of disrespect had ignited a feud that would smoulder for decades, one that would flare up again and again until it spilt back into that very same cemetery 25 years later. But as courtrooms filled and judges barked verdicts, another kind of confrontation was building, one that would bring two armies back to Tuam streets, just months away from catastrophe. The Irish courts had never seen anything like it. Dozens of names, 2 families, hundreds of pages of testimony. The fallout from the 1996 graveyard riot turned into one of the longest and most tangled legal sagas in district court history. At a special sitting in Tuam, Judge Michael Connellan was blunt. There is nothing but bickering and fighting between the McDonaghs and the wards, and the only way to deal with it is in a hard and stiff manner. He called their behaviour beyond a joke. These people, he said, have too much time on their hands and get too much money. They shouldn't be let in anywhere when they can't conduct themselves. The court handed down real sentences. In November 1998, John McDonagh, David McDonagh and Michael Boxer Ward were each jailed for 2 months after brawling at Tuam's dole office, despite what seemed like a ceasefire at the time. Judge Connellan made no excuses. These people are at it the whole time, and the only way to stop it is to imprison them. Inside the courtroom, the full horror of 1996 resurfaced. Another Garda, Jim Elise, gave evidence of a riot outside the McDonagh family home. Dennis Ward admitted to wielding a slash hook and assaulting Edward McDonagh Jr., leaving a gash across his arm and an indentation in his forehead. He also smashed Marguerite McDonagh in the face with a rock, breaking her nose at the cemetery. Judge Connellan didn't hold back. He called them warring travellers, accused them of behaving in an appalling manner, and compared them to savages. These people have no respect for law and order. But something had begun to shift. By late 1998, there were signs, a fragile calm settling in, enough that Judge Connellan suspended some of the heavier sentences, not because they weren't deserved, but because he feared opening old sores. That calm had not come on its own. Behind the scenes, things were boiling over again. One bare-knuckle fight between younger hotheads had already brought traffic in Tuam Square to a halt. Then came the whispers. Both families were calling in backup. September 1998. Over 200 wards and an equal number of McDonaghs and their Sweeney allies gathered on opposite sides of town. Convoys rolled into Tuam from across Ireland. Wards from Galway City, McDonaghs and Sweeneys from Longford, splitting into rival camps at Parkmore Estate and Gilmartin Road. The town was on edge. Garda intelligence confirmed the worst. Someone had challenged the other side to a street fight, and weapons, pickaxe handles, clubs, more were being stockpiled. Superintendent Bill Fennell moved fast. Raids were launched, weapons seized, but the most decisive move came next. Gardaí detained 4 representatives from each family, 4 wards, 4 McDonagh Sweeney men, and marched them into Tuam Garda Station. No threats, no court orders, just one chance to stop the streets from running red again. For 90 minutes, they sat face to face. Shouting echoed through the station. Years of hatred poured out, but in that cramped room, something happened. An agreement was made. A peace deal. Locals would later call it the Good Wednesday Agreement. No blood was spilt. No riot broke out. The convoys turned around. Inside Tuam Garda Station, the shouting could be heard through the windows. For 90 minutes, 4 men from each side sat across from one another. Wards on one end, McDonagh Sweeney on the other. No lawyers, no microphones. Just rage, resentment, and 2 decades of unfinished business. Gardaí stood outside the room, listening, watching, waiting to see if peace was still possible. And then, somehow, it was. When the doors opened, Mike Ward stepped out, holding a piece of paper. His voice was sharp, but satisfied. It's all sorted, genuine and in writing. What more do you want? Patrick Sweeney followed behind him, speaking for the McDonagh side with a crooked grin. We've kissed and made up, and we're great friends now. It's all over. Superintendent Bill Fennell, who had chaired the meeting, didn't smile, but he nodded. This was the first time the 2 sides got together. They have reached an agreement. I would be confident it will work. That night, as word spread of a traveller ceasefire, something unusual happened. The crowd, hundreds of people from both clans, simply dispersed. No fights, No weapons, no blood spilt. Local traveller leaders welcomed it. Even councillor Ellen Mongan, whose extended family had been at the centre of the original 1996 funeral, praised the effort. She hoped it might become a model for resolving other feuds. And it nearly did. By the end of 1998, a wary quiet fell over Tuam. Not forgiveness, not trust, but silence. The feud between the Wards and the McDonaghs was not resolved. It was put away, tucked behind a handshake and an understanding. Ignore each other or lose everything. For more than 2 decades after the Good Wednesday Agreement, Tuam existed in a delicate stillness. There were no more graveyard riots, no more convoys, no more slash hooks on suburban streets. The Wards and McDonaghs kept their distance. Ignore each other from now on, as the pact demanded. They avoided eye contact at weddings, kept to their own corners at funerals. The feud, once a public storm, became a private memory. But the silence was brittle. Tension never left Tuam. It lived in the pauses between conversations. In this way, one name made another family tighten their jaws. And though open clashes had vanished, the instinct to retaliate, to defend pride with fists, or worse, never truly disappeared. By 2010, that instinct broke the surface again. This time, not between the Wards and McDonaghs, but between the Wards and the Sweeneys, who had once stood with the McDonaghs during the truce. It began with a breakup. Anne Ward, a young woman from Tuam, had been dating Patrick Sweeney. When she ended the relationship and chose someone else, emotions boiled over. That personal fallout triggered a chain of violent skirmishes across the town. Baseball bats, knives, screwdrivers. The fights were crude, scattered, but undeniably familiar. Then came the climax, September 2010. Rather than let it spiral, both families agreed to settle it the Traveller way. 2 women, Linda Ward and Sharon Sweeney, stepped into a circle. Surrounded by a crowd, it was an arranged bare-knuckle punch-up. No gloves, no officials, just fists and pride. The fight lasted 15 minutes. Hair flying, heads snapped back, fists landing with full force. Linda Ward said they tore heads and boxed like veterans, and watching over it all, standing inside the ring, was Pa Bandy Ward, the elder who had organised and refereed the match himself. There was no winner, no handshake, only bruises and silence. 20 people were later brought to court, but the message was clear. The Wards were still a force, and the rules of settlement still included fists. Through the 2000s and 2010s, the truce with the McDonaghs had held, but it held under tension. Figures like Michael Boxer Ward and John Smurf McDonagh Sr., once frontliners in 1996, stepped back. Some moved on, some focused on family or boxing training, but the next generation watched and listened. They heard the story of the graveyard fight, not from reporters, not from judges, from uncles, fathers, cousins. They heard who stood, who struck first, and who never got justice. As one local put it, one crowd, who were very young at the time, let the resentment grow. They never let go the bitterness. And by 2020, those listeners were no longer boys. They were grown men, with no scars from 96, and no loyalty to the peace their fathers had made. All they needed was a reason, and in 2021, that reason arrived. Not with fists, not with knives, but with videos, voice notes, and public call-outs. On social media, the silence ended with a ping. By spring 2021, the truce that had kept Tuam's streets quiet for over 20 years was crumbling, not in the alleys, not at a funeral, but on Facebook and WhatsApp. It started with taunts, minor, petty. Then came the videos, face to camera, curses flying, names called, call-outs were posted publicly, each one sharper, louder, more personal. The 2 names at the centre, Tom Smurf McDonough Jr., Anthony Anony Ward, a nephew of Dinny Ward. By April, The feud was out in the open again. Only this time, it had an audience. In one video, Anthony Ward grinned, flashed 3 thick wads of €100 notes. "I'm going to be there Wednesday. This is my 30,000 euros, he said, waving the money in the air. "What you're trying to do, beat me. A lot of fellas tried it. You'll be another one." It was a challenge, a public dare. The McDonaghs replied, "Isn't kind." Tom Smurf and McDonagh Jr. answered with cool contempt, "There's no limits on this. Make it as much money as you want. If you can't fight, you're going to be a very sorry man." The insults escalated, but so did the stakes. Behind the scenes, local mediators tried to cool things down. No one wanted a repeat of '96, but the younger men weren't interested in memory. They were chasing something else, vindication. By early summer, the terms were set. 1-on-1, bare fists, 30,000 euros each. Winner takes 60,000 euros. The match would follow tradition. Fair play men would referee. It would be clean, controlled, settled the travel away. But what happened next only made things worse. The fight took place in July 2021. A remote field outside Tuam, a makeshift ring, ropes taped to traffic cones, refereed by 2 respected neutrals. Tom McDonaghs, taller, lean. Anthony Ward, shorter, stocky, fists like bricks. They circled, then collided. Ward came out swinging. Aggressive, wild, brutal. Within minutes he dropped McDonaghs with a thunderous right hook. As Smurf hit the ground, Ward lunged, threw another punch before he was back up. "No hitting while he's down. I know your emotions are high, but..." the referee warned, stepping in. The fight resumed. Punches flew, venomous, fast, personal. Then, as they locked up, Ward's head snapped forward. A headbutt to McDonagh's face. The sound cracked. The crowd gasped. "No headbutting!" Final warning. Seconds later, another headbutt. "One more time and you're gone." The two refused to shake hands during breaks. Blood streaked their faces. Then it happened again. A third headbutt. Hard, deliberate, violent. Game over. The referees rushed in. Arms raised. Fight stopped. By disqualification, Anthony Ward had lost. Smurf McDonaghs was livid. "You waster! You effing tramp!" he screamed as others held him back. "You want a dirty fight? You'll never be able for me." The Ward camp argued their man was winning, until rules got in the way. The referees disagreed. The 60,000 euros held by a third party was awarded to the McDonaghs side. The referee's voice was clear. "Be honest. Headbutting 3 times? There's nothing we can do." What was meant to be a settlement fight became a fresh fracture. No pride restored. No feud resolved. Instead, rage, online retaliation, and a growing certainty that the next clash wouldn't be in a roped-off field. The 60,000 euro match, intended to contain the fire, had only poured petrol on it, and the fallout that was still to come. Wednesday, 22nd September 2021. A day meant for mourning descended into a scene so chaotic, so violent, so surreal, that one priest would later call it like something from Beirut. That afternoon, 2 funerals were scheduled back-to-back at Tuam's Catholic Cathedral, an adjoining cemetery on Athenry Road. The first, around midday, was for Martin Ward, a local man in his 30s. The second, seemingly unrelated, was the burial of Teresa Tessie Ward, a 70-year-old neighbour with ties to neither side of the feud. The violence between the 2 funerals happened deliberately, not by accident. As the Ward family paid their respects at Martin's grave, they didn't leave. A large group of young Ward men lingered, waiting, watching. By 3:30 p.m, the funeral cortege for Tessie Ward arrived. Among the mourners were members of the McDonaghs family, likely family friends or distant relations, as they carried the coffin toward the grave. Something snapped. No words, no warning. Instead, a surge of violence. Around 30 young men, mostly Wards, rushed the graveside, ambushing the McDonaghs during one of their most vulnerable moments. The attack was ferocious. Stones flew, screams pierced the air, chunks of broken headstones rained down on the pallbearers. A woman yelled, "Go behind the wall!" and children bolted behind tombstones as chaos overtook the cemetery. Families ran, mothers wept, the grieving became the hunted. An eyewitness, still breathless days later, recalled the insanity. "I saw a fella pull one of them big wooden crosses, about 4 feet tall, right out of the ground and belt the head of 2 other fellas with it. Others produced knives, slash hooks, even a handsaw and a pitchfork were reportedly used. The cemetery had become a medieval battlefield." Father Ray Flaherty, the local priest who had presided over the funeral mass, rushed toward the melee. He raised his voice, begged for calm. "I pleaded with all concern to stop, but you might as well be shouting in the wind." Rocks crashed past him. One whistled inches from his head. Father Flaherty dived behind a tree for cover, later admitting he feared he might witness someone killed before his eyes. That fear wasn't unfounded. One man, stabbed and slashed multiple times, collapsed in the grass with a serious head injury, bleeding profusely, while onlookers screamed for help. "He was losing a lot of blood. It was unbelievable," said a witness. The Gardaí, initially just a few officers, were overwhelmed, outnumbered and unarmed. They retreated. Cars squealed out of the graveyard, reversing through tomb-lined paths as rocks and bricks slammed into windshields. Phones lit up across the county. Emergency calls flooded Garda lines. Then the cavalry arrived. Within minutes, 30 Gardaí from across Galway swarmed the area. Armed officers, detectives, traffic corps, even the regional armed support unit. 5 ambulances tore toward Tuam. The Irish Air Corps scrambled a military helicopter to airlift the most seriously wounded man to University Hospital Galway. By 4 p.m, Gardaí in full riot gear moved in, physically separating the mobs, forcing the factions back. In the chaos, they arrested a boy with a knife, believed to have been attempting to stab a rival. He was disarmed and taken into custody on the spot. The aftermath was apocalyptic. Blood-stained sticks, broken crucifixes, discarded weapons. Clean-up crews moved through the sacred grounds, collecting the remnants of rage. A second priest, arriving to bless the graves, stood frozen. It looked like something from Beirut. Across Tuam, roads were closed, sports matches were cancelled. Garda forensic teams combed the cemetery for evidence. The town, once again, was stunned into silence. 7 people were injured badly enough to require hospitalisation. Slashing wounds, stabbings, trauma that could easily have ended lives. The bereaved families, those who came only to bury their loved ones, apologised publicly through Father Flaherty, horrified that their final goodbyes had been overshadowed by tribal violence. The Garda investigation was launched immediately. Video clips were collected, witnesses were interviewed, and within days, the list of suspects grew. In the end, 8 individuals, 7 men and 1 woman, were formally charged with violent disorder and related offences. Tuam's courts were busy once more, just like in 1996, just like in 1998. The feud had returned, louder, bloodier, and more public than ever before. The day after the graveyard riot, Tuam was on edge. The blood had barely dried. Families were still reeling. And yet, behind the stunned silence, everyone in town knew it wasn't over. Local councillors scrambled to respond. On September 23rd, 2021, Galway Bay FM broadcast the growing concern. Tuam area councillors are calling on the leaders of the groups involved in yesterday's violence to come to the table for peace talks. Local councillor Donna Keelalea reminded the public it had nothing to do with the feud. The innocent deserved peace, even if the guilty wouldn't allow it. But fear lingered. Fine Gael councillor Pete Roach gave voice to what many whispered. If something isn't done fast, they'll retaliate. and the next time might be worse. Those who had once brokered the 1998 peace dusted off old strategies. There were whispers of urgent meetings, clergy involvement, and traveller mediators. Fianna Fáil, Councillor Donogh Kililea formally invited the feuding families, offering neutral ground to talk, before things spiralled further. But on the streets and online, a different conversation was happening. Less than 24 hours after the riot, a video appeared on Facebook. Shot in Tuam, the footage showed dozens of ward men marching shoulder to shoulder. They strode in formation through Gilmartin Road, into St Enda's Avenue, and across an open field, a silent, synchronised show of strength. Some wore hoods, others concealed their faces, but when they reached the field, one man stepped forward. Surrounded by his kin, he faced the camera and unleashed a tirade aimed directly at the McDonaghs. The Smurfs. You came to the graveyard yesterday, blackguarding. We were at that graveyard to show respect. His voice burned with rage. His message was clear. You came with weapons. Boys, our fair fights are over and done with. There's no fair fights anymore. This is how it's going. When we meet, it's all dirt from here on out. He went further, accusing the McDonaghs of attacking a 72-year-old woman during the cemetery chaos. You should be ashamed of yourselves. As the camera panned, he raised his voice above the growing crowd behind him. We're all sticking together. The Galway wards, the Mount Bellow wards, the Tuam wards. When we meet, we'll sort it out. There was no mistaking the message. This statement didn't serve as a warning. It made a clear promise. The McDonaghs didn't flinch. They hit back with a video of their own. A member of the Smurf McDonagh faction appeared on screen, sneering at the ward's dramatic parade. You never wanted to go the whole hog with us, you fucking cowards. He mocked their choice to film in friendly territory. You make a video at your backyard, talking about fair fights is over. You were never going to fight fair. You were never able for us. It was a digital firefight, words replacing fists, for now, but the venom was just as real. Behind the screens, Gardaí grew increasingly alarmed. The feud was no longer whispered between families. It was on full public display. Rumours spread like wildfire. Both sides were recruiting allies from other traveller groups, mobilising, preparing for the next battle. Memories of 1998 surfaced fast. But this time, the state refused to wait. Gardaí formed a special task force, launched armed patrols in Tuam's estates, and blanketed the area with surveillance. Inside the traveller community, respected voices spoke up. Father Ray Flaherty, still shaken after diving for cover during the riot, made a public plea. It was very shocking. I was very shaken by the whole thing. Leaders within the travelling community need to sit down and talk things over. Even members of the feuding clans, those untouched by the fight, joined the push for peace. Edward McDonagh, a boxing coach and brother to the main McDonagh line, revealed he'd attended numerous peace meetings with an independent mediator, a Garda inspector, and a former mayor of Tuam. Everything was going well. No incidents and everything was calm, he later said. And for once, his words held true. In the months following the riot, Gardaí reported only a few minor incidents. The streets cooled, the social media taunts faded, and in Tuam, for the first time in weeks, a wary calm returned. But it was a fragile quiet, the kind that comes before the next storm. As Tuam exhaled in the uneasy quiet that followed the graveyard chaos, the machinery of justice rolled forward with unrelenting weight. In April 2022, Gardaí brought 8 individuals to Tuam District Court, each charged with violent disorder tied to the bloody cemetery clash. But the case was too grave, too complex for the lower courts. It moved up to the Galway Circuit Court, where the past caught up with the very men who had once roamed the streets of Tuam unchecked. Among them stood John Smurf McDonaghs Sr., a name long etched in the annals of the feud, a veteran of the 1996 riot, and father of the younger Smurf, who had fought in the €60,000 bare-knuckle match. John Sr. now faced a jury. In June 2024, after 5 tense days in court, The verdict was delivered, guilty of violent disorder. Judge Brian O'Callaghan did not hold back. He called the fight an abomination, condemning the sheer recklessness of a feud that unfolded before children, clergy and grieving families. The wards and the McDonaghs existed, and nobody else, the judge seethed, scorning their total disregard for human life. He added that he did not hear a single apology or any sign of remorse. And with that, John McDonagh Sr. was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a suspended 2.5-year tale trailing behind him like a warning bell. But the reckoning didn't stop there. In January 2025, 5 more McDonagh men, 2 generations of them, pleaded guilty. Yarlath Sr., Patrick, David, Stephen and John Jr. McDonagh faced the court. This time, Judge O'Callaghan compared their actions to animals. 5 cattle wouldn't have acted the way ye acted. His fury was palpable. And though some received suspended sentences, 2, Stephen and David, were sent straight to prison. Victims had their say too. Charlie Ward, stabbed 4 times during the graveyard riot, detailed his suffering. 47 surgical staples, PTSD, constant fear. There seems to be no end to these attacks, he said, voicing what Tuam feared, that the feud had not died, only gone quiet. And so, justice was served, but not peace. The courts handed down sentences, the police ramped up patrols, the community held its breath. But the deeper question lingers. Did justice stop the war, or simply pause the next round? Why did a decades-old truce crumble over a screen full of call-outs? How many more young men carry grudges written in the blood of their uncles? And when the next burial is scheduled, will it be just another funeral, or the next battlefield? The cycle may have slowed, but in Tuam, did it never really end?